ready for our next session, and we want to begin with Rick Greiwe. Rick is the former chair of the Ohio Riverway. He's just an amazing guy. Rick, thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Francis, we have the. Oh, good morning. We're going to start off the session with a little mental gymnastics. We all conjure up images when we recall regions of the U.S. Close your eyes for a minute and take a mental tour of a few regions. Pacific Northwest, New England, the Great Lakes, Rocky Mountains. The Seneca's image of our region was, oh, hi, yo, beautiful river. The river valley region that we're in is defined by a topography and an ecological zone of the Ohio River and its tributaries. The rivers, the hills, the valley ecosystem is unique geography in the U.S. It can be branded, and its cultural and recreational resources can be leveraged to attract tourists, residents, and talent. That's why we're here today. Now, let's look at this Michael Gallus image of this region. So you can see there's 4 North American environmental zones that converge here. That's very unique. We have the Till Plains, the Lexington Plains, the Highland Rim, and the Cumberland Plateau. The Ohio River and its tributaries reach into this region. And you can see once you get beyond the river region, it's flat. So we have a big attraction here, this topography. Next, the river and its series of tributaries form a backbone of a very scenic valleys and ridgelines. All those red lines are ridges, which really give us a very distinctive feeling when you come into this zone. So we have a mental image of the Ohio River and its river valley region, but there's a few very strong common themes. Beautiful river, verdant valleys and hills, and riverine cities and towns. Let's move on to the experiences that apply to region. Here are a few examples from my own experience. Imagine a bike ride on the Tart Trail. Start at a microbrewery at Suttons Bay, then past cherry orchards, beautiful rolling farm hills, a stop at a farm-to-table lunch, then a winery in the afternoon, followed by a charming B&B in Traverse City. Or a trip to New Orleans. Go to Dixieland Jazz, see the colorful parades before Mardi Gras, charming French Quarter architecture, an art fair in Jackson Square, a riverboat ride, etouffee, jambalaya, beignet. Please stop me. These recreational and cultural assets and sites and events are all experiences that make a place memorable. We've joined together as Ohio Riverway to develop and promote these regional assets. We have a huge economic and quality of life opportunities. The recreation economy is powerful. It not only creates jobs and great spending, but also a high quality life. Just look at this spending in this economy sector. 187 billion in consumer spending annually, 7.6 billion jobs, 6.5 billion in federal tax revenues, and 59 billion in state and local revenue. Look at this chart. Oh, this is one behind. Okay, good. So absorb that for a minute. It's amazing. Here's another amazing statistics. The percentage of jobs in this sector. In my industry, only 2.1% of the jobs are in real estate. Further in the chart, if you can't read that, construction is just 6.4%. The recreation industry is 7.6 million jobs. And then you have healthcare and other things that are bigger, but this is a huge sector of our economy. So the Ohio River Valley, as Brew mentioned earlier, has every outdoor recreation category. Biking, hiking, camping, backpacking, boating, fishing, great opportunity. And another one is called cultural or heritage tourism. It accounts for 40% of all tourism dollars. So you think of tourism as people land on the beach. The huge part is just people that want experiences. They go to museums, they go to events, they go to attractions and sites, historic sites. There is $120 billion of spending last year in this category, and it has a compounded annual growth rate of 3.5% over the next decade. So this is another exciting opportunity because these visitors are motivated to learn and discover. They value historic and cultural sites and want authentic experiences. And boy, you can get them here in the Ohio Valley, just walking through Lawrenceburg on the way to the conference today. So look at, again, each of these categories have different qualities of cultural tourism. They're not just the things you imagine like museums, but they're special events, they're festivals, they're historic sites, archaeological, as well as historic. So lots of opportunities here. So the whole point of this exercise was to say that the Ohio River Way can deliver on these experiences. Here's the braided trail that you've seen before. It outlines the tourism and entertainment attractions in one color, the historic sites in another, recreation assets, ecological sites, the walk and bike and trails. But again, this is just a concept. We have to work collaboratively. It's a hard one. We have to work together on a strategic plan to develop and promote these assets. I'm going to conclude with just a few Ohio River Way experiences that I think are within reach. And this is my own list. You all have your own. For example, the Freedom Trail. We could start that tour at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. And then some of the content that they have there could be put on an app. And you can have a personal tour of the Ohio Valley with all these sites that are important you could learn about. With great visuals, with rich history. The same app could be provided to bus tour operators. And the towns that are adjacent to these sites could be doing programming to, again, hold people in their towns when they're there. The ancient inhabitants of the Ohio Valley. Again, we're going to be a world site designated here soon. And it's really exciting to see that those series of sites throughout Southern Ohio could, again, be explained with the start of the museum center in Cincinnati. They have treasure troves of artifacts from these indigenous people, including seashells that used to be traded as money up and down the valley. So the reach of the Gulf up into these Ohio valleys were very evident during that time. Again, those visuals, those artifacts can be shared with some of these outlying sites. And again, a rich app can be put together to give you more meaning as you're driving with your kids through through these sites in Ohio. The Edge of the Appalachian touring. I just had an experience a couple weeks ago where bunch of 10 guys, old guys, average age 70. We couldn't handle the hills at Hocking, but we stayed at the Hocking Hills Lodge, which is beautiful. Brand new state park lodge, great food, hot tub, the whole thing. And so we drove to Logan and took the bike trail from Logan to Ohio University. And again, along the trail was beautiful. There was a microbrewery for lunch. There was a fun tour through campus that we did on our bikes. Again, a great fall experience. And again, all those kinds of things can happen in loops out of these river towns up and down the river with not just better identification, but better lodging experiences. We have to have more Murphin Ridges. We have to have more restaurants that serve unique river cuisine. We have to have these things well marked out and developed. It's more than signs, folks. It's these other assets that make people want to stay and return. The Steamboat Age Tour. Again, we have B&B Riverboats and other companies up and down the river. We have the American Queen Company that sends 2 or 3 overnight boats here. But again, we need the app that will give you the history of the Steamboat Age, where the yards where these boats were built. How much commerce is happening on the river today because of that start. Again, which would enrich the driving tour or the bus tour or the actual people that are on the riverboats and their experience of the Ohio River Way. The Bourbon Trail, again, this is very well developed. I mean, you don't have to talk about that. Great dining, great hotels, great B&Bs, great tours of the bourbon distillers. But again, let's start those tours from the river towns. You know, when you start your journey in Cincinnati, you start at New Riff, and that's the trailhead for the Bourbon Trail. You start in Louisville and get the Bardstown experience. So a lot of opportunities to leverage a very well-developed industry. Brewmaster's Trail. Again, you know, Cincinnati was brewing more beer than Milwaukee or St. Louis, but the Germans drank it all. So that never grew. But there's a great walking tour of all those sites in downtown Cincinnati. And again, there's microbreweries are exploding in all these river towns. Again, let's get people more information about where they are, why they're unique, special tastings that you can go on a day and go to 4 different microbreweries up and down the river. And then legacies like the Purple People Bridge lighting. There's a group that's trying to animate the bridge in Newport that would be lit up every night with a show, a light show, like you see in the Bellagio fountain when you go to Las Vegas. So again, one of the legacies, the permanent capital improvements, that will be attractions that people will recall and say, yeah, I don't want to miss my long destination weekend in the Ohio River Way. And then signature festivals. There's a group of us working on doing an event for America's 250th anniversary, which is in 2026. And, you know, can you imagine bringing back the 15 tall stacks from all the different river cities? Having chefs from 8 different river cities do river cuisine, have American Rivers Roots music, all the blues, jazz, zydeco, bluegrass, you name it, in one spot. So again, how do you use events to bring people to the Ohio River Way? And once they're here, they have these extended tours that keep them here for 2 or 3 days. So these are just a few of my musings, but all of us during this conference will ask the question, you know, what are the cultural and recreational assets that need to be developed in your area? We'll be exploring these together. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, buddy. You just nailed it. Very grateful and sorry for the squeeze on your time-wise, but we're trying to stay up to date. So next we have, because one of the big issues here is, yeah, but the river is dirty and dangerous, right? Why you encourage people to make use of it, to build restaurants that float on it, et cetera. So we have the expert here. Dr. Chris Lorentz runs the Thomas More, Ohio Biology Field Station. You can describe it more accurately, but Chris, we're grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brew. Thank you, Ivy Tech, for this beautiful venue to hold the meeting. I'd like to thank Brewster and David and Francis for the invitation and the opportunity to speak, and thank Brewster for the title, Busting Myths About the Ohio River. So like he said, I'm a professor of biological sciences at Thomas More University. I'm also an aquatic biologist, and I work at this place, our biology field station, which is on River Mile 451 in Campbell County, just across the river from New Richmond, Ohio. And if you want to come out for a tour of the labs, I'll certainly welcome you to do so, as well as maybe go out sampling with us on the river. And this is the picture that we like to think of. This is the image that we think of when Rick was doing the mental gymnastics of the Ohio River. And the Ohio River is one of the most diverse rivers in the country from an ecological perspective. And I would argue that it's one of the most resilient given the management of the river historically. And on our Senko's website, Richard Harrison's staff samples the river for the last 75 years, particularly the fish populations. The Ohio River supports over 160 species of fish. It's a very diverse river, one of the most diverse rivers in the country from the aquatic community perspective. and one of the myths to bust, no three-eyed fish anywhere in the river. In fact, we've been sampling fish for 55 years at our field station. We've collected nearly 90,000 fish during that time. And we get less than 1% of the fish have what's called delts, deformities, erosions, lesions, and tumors. And most of those are lesions in our catfish that are bumping up against epifaunal substrate that would degrade in the river. So less than 1% of the 90,000 fish in the river that we've caught have any sorts of deformities, erosions, lesions, and tumors, and most of those can be attributed to natural causes. And so when you look beneath the surface, where we spend time studying the river, and where Richard's staff spends time studying the river and others, this is what we see. Again, over 160 species of fish, some relic prehistoric fish like paddlefish, lamprey, gar, and sturgeon, along with glowfin. Nowhere else in the world do you get those assemblages of prehistoric fish other than the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri River. So we are tops in the world when it comes to aquatic communities right out here in our backyard in the Ohio River. And when we look at our trends of the river over the 55 years we've been studying it, we see a major improvement since 1971, not coincidentally coinciding with the Clean Water Act and other legislations to clean up our waterways. Our species richness has increased over those years. Furthermore, the sensitive species within that community are rebounding as well. Sensitive species are species that are intolerant to pollution, yet we see them coming back over that same 50-year period. Things like centrarchids, our sunfishes and black basses, our sport fish, smallmouth, largemouth bass are coming back, as well as a family called catastomids. In particular, that's a red horse on the bottom right. These are species that were near exterminated from the river in the 60s and 70s, but they made a huge comeback over the last 50 years. But we see headlines like this. What about this headline? Industry dumped more toxic pollution in the Ohio River than any other U.S. watershed in 2020. And this is from a recent article just last October. So it seems paradoxical, right? We have a really diverse aquatic community, and yet we get headlines like this, which certainly warrants attention and certainly is accurate. So if we look at the top waterways in the country in terms of the amount of chemicals put in the river, the Ohio River ranks top with over 30,000 pounds of chemicals. Well, certainly an accurate statement, but we have to qualify it and we have to put it in context. This is the important follow-up to that headline. When we look at the Ohio River, 70% of those chemicals come from one source, a plant down in Rockport, Indiana. 70% come from one source, and those chemicals are nitrates in the wastewater that Richard Harrison mentioned. These are nutrients, and over 90% of those chemicals in the river are nutrients, non-toxic to humans. Furthermore, when we look at pollution, it's really important to take into account the concentration and density. They matter. So there's those 30,000 pounds of pollution on the left and 100 times less pollution on the right, 300 pounds. When you put those chemicals into a big body of water, the impact is minimal, almost negligible. Where you put them in a smaller body of water, much less chemicals, you have pollution. So the river is not the most polluted river by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it meets water quality standards. So the large volume of water in discharge of the Ohio River mitigates the impacts of those chemicals in the river. So the sheer volume needs to be put in the context of the impact on water quality. So when we look at the Ohio River Trail, the EPA maximum contaminant level, these are water quality standards for those chemicals that make up 90% of the chemicals put into the river, nitrates. The EPA standard is 10 parts per million. And that includes nitrogen, nitrate, and nitrite. For nitrate itself, it's 45 parts per million. Let's look at the chemical concentrations in the river. Up at Belleville Pool, it's 1.08. So the limit is 10. You can be up to 10 and meet water quality safe standards. We're at 1.8 in the Belleville Pool. In the Markland Pool, we're at 1.22 parts per million. Well below the water quality standard. Go down to McAlpin Pool, 1.30. So when you look at the impacts of those chemicals in the river, they're negligible. The water quality standards 10 parts per million, we're at 1, 1.2, 1.08 consistently along this stretch and the rest of the stretch of it. And if we have need more evidence, we have a clean, abundant water source out here in our backyard. This is a water quality report put out by the Greater Cincinnati Water Works, and all the utilities put out something like this. And when you look at the possible contaminants in the river, those nitrates aren't on the list. We're not worried about those nitrates from a public health perspective. And in fact, the Greater Cincinnati Water Works, as well as all the water utilities, meet or exceed all state and federal health standards. Right, so we have a abundant drinking water source. As Richard said, we can reasonably treat it for clean, healthy water. So the Ohio River Resources supports a rich, abundant diversity of aquatic life. Check. The Ohio River provides an abundant source of drinking water for upwards of 5 million people. Check. But what about contact recreation? Is it safe to boat, fish, and swim in the river? So when we have events like the Paddle Fest or the Great Ohio River Swim, are we safe to do so? When we talk about contact recreation, we want to distinguish between two types. Primary contact recreation is when you fish, or excuse me, swim, ski, water tube. That's called primary contact recreation. If you're fishing or boating, paddling in a river, that's secondary. And there's different standards for both types of recreation. But let's take the most stringent standards, those for primary contact. So is it safe to actually swim in the river, ski in the river, and tube in the river? Well, the standard is measured by the amount of E. coli in the river. So the water quality standard is 130 colony forming units over a 90-day geometric mean. Essentially, Richard's staff goes out, samples the river 5 times a month, takes a mean of that. And if it's over 130, it's not meeting water quality standards to swim, ski, or tube on the river. In other words, primary contact recreation. And as he mentioned, they put out a report every year or every other year assessing the river. And this is the E. coli concentrations along the river, and they focus on 6 CSO communities. CSOs are combined sewer overflows, the biggest source of E. coli in the river. So those cities are off to the right. Whoops. Pittsburgh, Wheeling, Huntington, Cincinnati, Louisville, Evansville. And you will indeed see Cincinnati's, that purple dot, will exceed those E. coli levels temporarily. On occasion, we're going above that. In those cases, you don't want to be primarily contacting the river on those cases. But the water quality criteria for contact recreations are highly dynamic. You could have one day where the entire stretch of the river meets or exceeds water quality standards. And then you have wet weather events and the E. coli spike for a couple of days. So essentially, in these 6 CSO communities, those are the main areas of concern for contact recreation. Overall, the river has 36% of it fully supports primary contact recreation. The criteria are less stringent for secondary recreation. 40% of the river is partially supporting, and that means it exceeds those standards 10 to 25% of the time. If it exceeds those standards over 25% of the time, it's not supporting contact recreation. We have times of the year where it doesn't. So essentially, during wet weather events at CSO communities, you're going to get E. coli spikes. And for a couple of days, you want to avoid swimming in the river, contacting the river. Other than that, low flow, dry weather, it's perfectly safe to contact recreate in the Ohio River. So the Ohio River, as I mentioned, supports a rich, abundant diversity of aquatic life, exceeds it, provides an abundant source of drinking water, and we'll add to the list, provides opportunities for all people to safely enjoy land and water trails connecting the natural riches and vibrant communities of the Ohio River, the Ohio Riverway vision statement. And I'll put a check mark there as well with an asterisk. And that asterisk is wet weather events We have issues with E. coli at CSO communities. Fortunately, with the consent decree, we're addressing those. And those conditions will fluctuate. They're very dynamic. And in the dry weather, the conditions are always met, the water quality standards. So I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak and thank all the sponsors and enjoy the day.
Give it up, yeah. Thank you, Chris. We do have time for a question.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Do the Asian carp have an impact on our local fish?
It's a great question. So she asked about Asian carp. Asian carp were brought here intentionally for the fish farm industry. They escaped from Arkansas ponds into the Mississippi River in the early 90s. They've been moving up the Mississippi and now they've moved up the Ohio River. So the Asian carp are an invasive species. They are a nuisance. They are impacting the river. Not from a public health perspective, a contact recreation perspective, but we're concerned about their impact with aquatic life.
One more question too, actually, quick. Yep.
The E. coli event is that response or is that in a weather event? Stormwater runoff, agriculture, excess water to sanitation plants, or all three?
Great. A little bit of all three, but primarily it's the combined sewer overflows where you have your wastewater coming into the plant. Now we have a wet weather event, the storm water is combined with the wastewater. And so we allow that to overflow so that we don't inundate the treatment plant. We are now separating our lines. So MSD in Cincinnati and SD1 in North Kentucky, where the communities along the river and others, Louisville, Indianapolis, Columbus, Lexington, Pittsburgh, we are all working to separate those lines to reduce the impacts of CSO.
Ruth, real quick. Yes.
How do we measure coal ash that gets into the water, from coal mines and things? How do we measure that?
Yeah, so the coal ash will maybe defer to Richard, but the coal ash does have contaminants like mercury in it, and they do measure mercury, in particular methyl mercury, which is low in the water. It essentially builds up in the fish tissues, and so they'll put out fish consumption advisories, or they'll gather data, and each state along the river is responsible for putting their fish advisories. But essentially, the coal ash impact would be the mercury concentration.
So would you feel safe eating fish out of the river?
That's a great question. So there's fish consumption advisories, and it's yes, but limit. Just like you have limits in the Great Lakes, just like you have limits on marine fish in the Gulf of Mexico, we're not unique in that regard, in that pollutions accumulate in the tissues of fish, particularly long-lived fish, and we need to limit our intake, but that's true across the country.
I was told that the company across from Cincinnati, a polishing company, can put 65 tons of mercury in the water every year. That's what is allowed. Am I incorrect?
So my guess is that they have permits, and those permits can mandate. And the point to remember is, what is the impact on the water quality standards in the water, in nature? I can't speak to that specifically, no.
Okay, folks, I know there's another question that maybe you guys can ask Chris right afterwards. But thank you very much, buddy. Wonderful presentation.